Welcome back to Neon Liberalism. I am Samantha Hancocksley. We're recording this on the morning of February 25th, 2026, the morning after Donald Trump's State of the Union speech. And the State of the Union is traditionally a moment for the president to look back over the past year and tout his accomplishments, and to look ahead over the next year and maybe make some suggestions about where it's going. And I thought this was maybe a good occasion to do that ourselves, to take a step back from the day-to-day outrages and madnesses of the second Trump administration and take that longer view to ask, how is it going? What did Trump? How is it going? What was Trump's theory of the case when he came into office? What has he tried to do, and how is it working for him? And so, to answer some of those questions, I'm very excited to have on Jamelle Bouie, a New York Times columnist, returning guest, and a friend of Liberal Currents. So, yeah, Jamelle, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, yeah, I mean, first question, I guess, is when Trump came into office back in January 2025, what do you think his theory of the case was?
I think, so the way I have understood this is that I think that Trump, and really the people around Trump, and I'm always wary of being like, well, what does Trump think? I'm not sure that Trump thinks in these terms. I think he mainly just wants to be able to act with impunity and steal money. And he'll kind of follow any path that allows him to do those things. But the Trump administration, the White House, I think its theory of the case was, first, that the 2024 election was something like an enabling act, that they understood the result as being full endorsement of Donald Trump as almost like this avatar of the American people. And thus they saw their administration as licensed to fundamentally remake American society around Donald Trump. And this is something, Liberal Currents has written a lot about, just sort of Trump as personalist authoritarian. And I think they saw the election as license for that. And I believe that their theory of the case, how they were going to accomplish this, was basically through speed, to use the presumption of good faith that typically goes to new presidents, especially presidents who happen to win the popular vote, which Trump did, to use that to kind of beat the rest of society into submission, to force major institutions to submit to personalist rule, to essentially take advantage of Congresses or the Republican Congress's total subservience, to cut Congress out of meaningful policymaking, even questions of revenue raising and revenue spending, and to do this as quickly as possible, to move fast, to assemble a paramilitary, to both do deportations, but also to intimidate political opponents. This was the experiment in using the National Guard to occupy Democratic-run cities, right? So the key here is just speed. And I've made this analogy in various places before, but it's of course an analogy I would make, because this is the stuff I'm obsessed with. But it does, like, the theory of the case is similar to the Confederacy's theory of victory, which isn't that they had to defeat or destroy the Union Army, but that they had to move quickly enough, strike fast enough and hard enough to basically force the Union public into submission, to make the Union public think it isn't worth it. I think that's basically what they attempted to do. Now, in both cases, the speed is kind of critical. In the Civil War, the speed was critical because by a certain point, if the Union public didn't submit, then the United States just had more natural advantages in terms of population and industry and the like. But also, the Confederacy had this huge vulnerability, which is that any sufficiently long enough conflict was going to endanger slavery. And if slaves start escaping to Union lines, that is lost manpower, and that might potentially mean soldiers for your opponent, right? You're losing both critical home front resources and potentially reinforcing your enemies. So it's not that Union victory was inevitable, but by a certain point, Confederate victory became so much more difficult. And a similar thing I think is true of the administration, that it needed to do this quickly, and it needed to hope that civil society would not start reacting, because ultimately the 2024 election wasn't an enabling act, and most Americans did not expect to be electing like a dictator or someone who viewed themselves basically as like sovereign over the nation. And so, given enough time, right, like the public would itself, or at least elements of the public, would begin to mobilize itself, even if political opposition wasn't particularly strong. And also, those elements of the public would likely include parts of the Trump coalition, which wasn't and isn't all MAGA, right? There are elements of it that are very provisional, that they voted for Trump for specific things, and if those things don't happen, they're going to be dissatisfied. I think that the year so far, year and some change, has like borne out this, that like they tried to move quickly for reasons related to their own capacities and ability to sort of like pull this off successfully. Like, this strategy requires a high level of competence, and it is to everyone's great advantage that the administration's made up of like flunkies and fail sons. So they moved quickly, but they couldn't quite consolidate. Some of the brain trust in the administration, guys like Stephen Miller, really appear to be fully high on their own supply and kind of cannot modulate or like make strategic or tactical retreats or do anything to maybe save some political standing, to recover somewhat with their own base. And then Trump's own obsessions have been like directly detrimental. The tariffs have been like a fatal political mistake. And have really eroded the president's standing with voters who otherwise might be with them. So I think at this point, like the theory of the case, we could do this quickly and consolidate, was wrong, and they have failed at that objective. And now I think it's really clear that the presidency is sort of adrift, and not entirely sure of what it's going to be doing for the next 3 years.
No, I think that unsurprisingly, I think that's a largely accurate picture. I think, especially like looking forward, the State of the Union is often a time to like sell the public on a new agenda, or at least to preview a new idea, and there's nothing there.
Yeah.
Right. There's just like what's coming next, and it's just this, like, he's just playing the hits again, or they're not even hits at this point. So I think that you're right that the administration is floundering a little bit. I'm also struck, though, that there are some things they did succeed at. Right, and you talked a little bit about moving fast, or in Silicon Valley language, moving fast and breaking things. And one of the big initiatives of the early Trump administration was DOGE, right? The Department of Government Efficiency under Elon Musk. What's your read on DOGE and like what it achieved or what it didn't, and how it fit into this strategy?
Yeah, so DOGE is an interesting wrinkle here, because I'm not necessarily sure. I'm going to walk back a bit. If you think of the Trump administration as comprising of basically like three actors who represent like three priorities, you have Stephen Miller, who is like, I want to ethnically cleanse the United States, and I'm going to turn the resources of the federal government towards that end. There's Russell Vought, who's like, I think that it is immoral that government does anything other than siphon money to the rich. So I'm going to do everything in my capacity to destroy the administrative state and the federal bureaucracy and basically make it totally subservient to Trump. And Vought has this sort of insane anti-constitutional vision of presidential power. And then Marco Rubio, who really appears to just want to get rid of Castro, and I'd say Rubio and Hegseth, right, who are sort of like want to use American military power in very aggressive ways to satisfy, in Rubio's case, a set of like, I think, ideological goals. I think he believes in the kind of you know, kind of domino theory for Latin America, where you knock out Maduro and then you can get the Castro, and then you can kind of like wipe left wing regimes out of Latin America. And then Hegseth, who this is sort of like, vulgar psychologizing, but who really seems to actualize his manhood through the application of violence, and so wants to use American military power for that reason. Elon Musk, who basically buys himself a place in the White House, is like, he doesn't quite fit this. I suppose DOGE is a bit coterminous with votes agenda, but the thing about DOGE is it was so haphazard and destructive that I think it ultimately was counterproductive for the administration, right? To gut large parts of the executive branch, fire tons of employees. In some areas, you could say, oh, well, this was just slashing government as Republicans have always wanted to do. But if you're trying to do this and also consolidate an authoritarian state, then there's a tension there. So, for example, there were thousands of lawyers in the DOJ who were doxed. This is now a problem, right? Because the DOJ has to deal with legal challenges to the president's, especially immigration policies, but so much of the president's efforts have incurred legal challenges. And so they need lawyers to be able to defend the administration in court. They need competent lawyers, lawyers who can maintain the presumption of regularity with district court judges, lawyers who can make good arguments, right? Who can win cases. And DOGE has directly impeded the ability of the Department of Justice, this Department of Justice that's fully subservient to the president's political interests, has eroded its ability to defend those interests. DOGE has eroded the ability of various parts of the executive branch to carry out what the president wants to accomplish. And so DOGE is interesting because it feels like, or it appears to be, this, Elon Musk spent $400 million to help Trump get elected. And Trump was like, congratulations, you can be kind of a de facto head of the cabinet. I was always struck by those early cabinet meetings where Elon Musk was just sort of like, basically like lecturing the rest of the cabinet, like almost like occupying the position of the president vis-a-vis the rest of the cabinet. You can do that.
Just so striking.
Right. Yeah. There's one photo in particular with Musk. He's in the Oval Office and he's like the focal point of the photo, and Trump is off to the side. And it's like, oh, it's his government right now. But that I would say that was at odds with what the administration's sort of signal goal was. And it's interesting, right, that after about 2 months, there's like this real backlash against DOGE, both in the public and the press, but also I think within the administration, as figures begin to realize that like this guy is causing us a lot of headaches, but also is making it difficult to do what we want to accomplish. So yeah, I think DOGE was successful for Elon Musk in as much as he was able to kind of gut a bunch of the American, science and technology establishment and clear competitors for his business interests. And so in a very narrow sense, DOGE was successful for Musk. But as a part of the Trump project, it actually feels like a false start. Like if you're like Jamelle, you want to consolidate an authoritarian regime in the United States, it's like I would get Elon Musk as far away from there as possible, right? Like that would be first on the agenda.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's come up, both at Liberal Currents on this podcast, is this tension between like the kind of administrative state that you need to like get stuff done in society versus like this kind of like destruction of elite competitors that other kinds of like personalist regimes are prone to. And I kind of want to ask you a little bit more about that aspect of capacity and something specific you mentioned, right? Which is that you need a lot of lawyers to get anything done, which I think is interesting. It's like there are times in history when like you would not think, okay, well, I need like thousands of lawyers. That's like the most important thing that I need to get anything done. It's like, well, why would you need a lawyer? But in the American system, you do.
Yeah.
Right. And this was kind of, I mean, you talked a little bit about vote. I don't know how to say that.
I've been informed by my editors that it is indeed vote. I was saying vote for a long time, and then they were like, it's vote.
Okay, well, my apologies to Mr. Vote for getting your name wrong. Um, anyways, but he has this theory, right, that like, it's really just the presidency and the courts, and Congress is like, okay, whatever. Um, and I think there's something to that, like as like de facto, like how is the system operating? Is we have an increasingly imperial presidency, and we have a court system that's doing its own thing. And I think a lot of people at the start of the Trump administration were like, well, I guess law doesn't matter anymore, right? That's all
Yeah.
out the window. Trump can do anything. Um, what's your read on like how has that gone? How has Trump's struggle with the courts worked?
It's interesting. The kind of supposition that the legislature doesn't matter, I think is true in as much as the legislature has chosen not to get involved, which is like the story of the past year. It's not so much that Congress does not have this power, as that Republicans in Congress don't give a shit. And so they're like, yeah, well, we'll let you do whatever you want. You could imagine a Congress that suddenly gives a shit, and then all of a sudden, all of this does come to a halt, right? Like if Congress decides to act, if it doesn't come to a halt, then at least it forces the issue, it forces constitutional conflict into the open in a way that would still be useful. But anyway, so there's this view they don't really need the law, that they can kind of do what they want to do through just pure executive decree. And again, it's interesting. It's interesting how much their theory of the election shapes their exercise of power. So they really did seem to view Trump as like the actual sovereign of the United States. So he issues executive orders saying he issued one executive order that was promptly ignored, but he issued it, and it was essentially K through 12 institutions in the United States can't have DEI anymore. And it's like, all right, but you don't like what you don't have any say over that, right? Like, and I don't mean that in the kind of facile, the Constitution doesn't let you do that. I mean that in the very literal. If someone tells, I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. If Trump issues an executive order saying to Charlottesville specifically, you can't have DEI in your schools anymore, the superintendent can be like, okay, and go about his day, because there's nothing the president can do. There's no lever or mechanism for authority the president can exercise in that case. But in the kind of mind space and the imagination of the administration, because he is like king of America, the way this is supposed to work is that he tells a law firm, you have to stop your DEI or we'll go after you. And the law firm has to say, okay, Mr. President, because you're the boss. It makes sense for Trump, given that like his main experience is the owner of a closely held enterprise, where that's how that works, right? And it's interesting that the among the capitalists most receptive to Trump are those in a similar kind of position, that they're not the ones answerable to boards or answerable to any kind of even like shareholder governance, but the ones who own the companies outright as almost like family businesses. This is an observation that's been made a bunch, but I think it's actually a really important one for thinking about why some elements of the capitalist class are much more Trump friendly than others have been. Anyway, they have this view of executive power that you can kind of govern by decree, but you can't. And you can't in large part because although the executive branch is Trump's, the courts are still quite ideologically and politically diverse. And more importantly, at the level of the Supreme Court, where it's all, I mean, this is my cynical legal realism, but it's all just like political and ideological preference going on up there. And at the level of the appeals courts, where it's like partly factual determination, partly just like ideological preference. Like no one's guessing how James Ho on the Fifth Circuit is ruling, because the guy's like a maniac, so we kind of know. But at the level of the district court, for the most part, those are people whose job it is to look at the facts and come to a ruling based on existing law. And so if you are an administration that is pushing past the boundaries of the law and violating people's rights and claiming authority you don't have, district courts are actually going to be the ones who are going to be most likely to be like, you can't do that. And that has been that. I think that's an obstacle that they just didn't anticipate whatsoever. And it slowed them down a bunch. Obviously, they can move so quickly that uh, uh, that all the district court rulings in the world can't stop certain things. But it has tied them up. It's tied up their resources, and it's forced appeals courts and the Supreme Court to basically intervene. And that's, to me, that's like the story of the courts and the administration. District courts are applying the law quite reasonably, and then appeals and Trump-friendly appeals courts and the Trump-friendly Supreme Court have to like create these, boutique exceptions to allow the administration to do what it wants to do, because what it wants to do kind of straightforwardly runs counter to what the law says. But to get to your point, Samantha, the fact that the administration seemed to discount the importance of having a fully staffed kind of like legal team on their side, I think it's been a real problem for them. And it might have been even unavoidable, because even the conservative lawyers at the DOJ are there. I mean, these are mission-driven people, and the mission is sort of upholding the laws of the United States. And I think one of the things that the Trump brain trust maybe didn't anticipate, and this is, I think, based on their experience with elected Republicans who themselves are responsive to, primary voters, but kind of conservative and Republican-leaning people in the federal bureaucracy they're still mission driven. They're still job driven. They still usually adhere to professional ethics, and doing things that are blatantly against the law or unconstitutional, or what have you, has led those people, if they haven't been DOGE, to just leave. And that too has been like, real attrition in the administration.
Yeah, there's this famous line. I can't remember if it's Stalin or Mussolini, and he says, "The Pope, how many divisions has he got?" To express the fact, like, okay, the Pope said whatever, but who cares? Because like we're counting armed men right now,
right?
And I think they kind of had that view of the courts. It's like, okay, the courts, whatever, how many divisions have they got? And the answer is, it turns out a lot.
Right. Yeah.
Right. The courts issue a ruling, and like, the administration tries to like dodge it or wriggle around it or find some little exception. But in large part, they have kind of like, the courts issue an order and the orders are obeyed. One of the cases that I found most striking was Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
Yeah.
Right. He's snatched up, he's deported, he's sent to this mega prison in El Salvador that nobody ever returns from. And the administration's position is, well, he's out of our hands, right? He's in a totally sovereign foreign country. There's literally nothing we can possibly do about it right now. And the courts are like, no, but seriously, you're going to go get him back? And they do. They actually went and they got him out of the prison and they brought him back to America. And like, they're still trying to do various legal proceedings against him. They're not going very well because, like you've kind of noted, the government, it seemed like the level of competence in government lawyers appears to be going down. And I mean, that's something that we see in a lot of these cases, like some really extraordinary cases of lawyers showing up to argue whatever immigration case before some federal judge and like having a breakdown, basically.
Yeah.
Right. Being like, I judge, I don't know what's going on. I showed up here yesterday. I'm supposed to argue this case or something. And the judge is like, yes, you're at a court. You just got sworn in, argue the case. And like, these lawyers are like struggling to do it. So I think you're right that they've really gotten held up at especially the lower courts level. But the courts in America are a very strongly hierarchical system, right? There's one court right at the top that nominally has authority over all the other ones. And maybe we have a slightly different view of how that's working for Trump, again, because like it's mostly Republicans on the court. So what's your view on the administration's ability to work with or against or through the Supreme Court?
Yeah. So I think there's a view that I disagree with. And the view that I disagree with is that when you look at how the administration has fared with the merits docket of the Supreme Court, which is basically what people recognize, a case that court picks a case since they pick their own cases. There's oral arguments, and then the court disappears for a couple months to come to a decision, and they read the decision, blah, blah, blah. On the merits docket, you can make a case, right, that like the court has actually been quite shown a bit of resistance to the administration. So earlier this year, there's Illinois v. Trump, where the court held that the administration's use of the National Guard was unlawful, that it has no legal authority to just sort of unilaterally commandeer the National Guard for basically crime fighting, but really kind of political intimidation. There's the recent, we're a little less than a week ago from when we're recording, the court struck down as unlawful the president's tariff, saying that the 6-3 majority, the 6 justices in the majority, 3 held the major questions doctrine, says that this is too big of a policy issue for the president to do unilaterally, so it's unlawful. And the 3 liberals were like, we think the major questions doctrine is fake and made up, but the statute clearly doesn't allow the president to do this, so it's unlawful. And those are 2, from one view, that's major, right? Like killing the National Guard stuff, knocking out the president's kind of chief domestic policy priority. The equivalent would have been had the Sebelius case under Obama had gone for the conservatives and they had struck down the Affordable Care Act entirety. Like that's kind of the equivalent level of damage to the president's domestic policy agenda. So that's like one view. I think there's like one other case where on the merits docket, the court has pushed back on Trump. But then there is what's called, depending on your view, the shadow docket, the emergency docket, the interim docket, the equities docket, a lot of names for it. But this is all the stuff that comes to the court that they don't have time to deal with in the merits docket, but they actually have to issue a ruling. Typically, over the past year, the administration has been doing things. It's been sued. The district courts have rendered a judgment against the administration, and then the administration appeals that judgment directly to the Supreme Court and says, we need you to issue a stay of the injunction because we need to be able to do our jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And when it comes to, and I think I prefer the shadow docket, not because, it does kind of sound sinister, which is good, but also because it kind of captures the lack of transparency here. Usually these rulings don't involve any explanation, don't involve any reasoning. It's just sort of the court says this. On the shadow docket, the administration has done quite well. That when it wants to rendition people to third countries without due process, even if eventually the court says you can't do that, hey, we read the Fifth Amendment. Turns out you can't do that. True story. Even when the court gets there, allowing it'll still allow the administration to do what it wants to do while it handles the merits. When it comes to revoking, when the administration revoked temporary protected status from a bunch of Venezuelan immigrants, the court let that go through. A district court judge blocked it, and the Supreme Court said, you can let that through. So on the shadow docket, the administration's had a lot of luck. And interestingly, the Supreme Court will issue these decisions in the shadow docket, and then in at least one case chastise district courts for ruling against the administration in similar cases, which isn't the way that should work, right? There isn't a merits decision here. So ostensibly the law hasn't actually changed, but the court is treating its shadow docket decisions as if they've changed the law. This has been the case with allowing the president to fire heads of independent agencies and rejecting the idea that Congress can mandate that those officers can only be removed for cause. The court is very skeptical of that, and essentially is demanding that district courts treat its stays of injunctions as a change to the law. I think that on the balance, looking at the shadow docket decisions gets you a clearer picture of what's happening here. And that's simply because those are places where there is less scrutiny. And so the court has a bit of a freer hand. And by allowing the administration to move forward with its actions, it is creating a situation where the balance of the equities, as a law nerd might say, favors the White House. Meaning, in other words, that the court doesn't maintain the status quo. The court changes the status quo. The court shows no particular interest in how a change to the status quo affects the particular parties. How this is supposed to work is a court says, in deciding whether to issue an injunction or issue a stay to an injunction, a court says, well, if we allow this to happen, the change to the status quo for one party might be so drastic that it cannot be recovered. And so we're gonna maintain the injunction and hear the case as is, because basically the damage or the whatever change is just too dramatic to allow the defendant to move forward or what have you. Court doesn't even give a shit. So they allow the administration to fire thousands of federal workers, to rendition people to third countries, to deport otherwise legal immigrants. And then when they finally get around to the merits case and they're like, oh, turns out maybe you can't do that, it's kind of too late. Doesn't really matter. The effect's already been had. And I think that is a much better way of looking at the administration's relationship to the Supreme Court. Maybe you could say that when it comes to whether or not the president has actually claimed all these new powers, the Supreme Court says, no, not so much. But can the administration effectively do the things it wants to do, regardless of whether or not the president has those powers? And the court says, basically, yes, it can. And for me, that's kind of the more important thing in the mix. And before I finish, all of this has to happen against the backdrop of Trump v. United States. So in summer 2024, the court issues his ruling declaring that criminal immunity for prosecution exists for the president in the Constitution as long as the president is performing his core duties. And even if you want to be highly legalistic and narrow, this isn't a ruling that gives like total immunity to the president. In theory, there are things the president could do that would fall outside of his core duties and thus be subject to criminal prosecution after he leaves office. In practice, when the Supreme Court hands out a ruling saying the president has criminal immunity for core duties, a dude like Donald Trump is going to be like, "Oh, that means I'm like above the law now."
Yeah, party time.
Yeah, so I actually don't think there's been this effort among more center and right-leaning legal analysts to try to present the Supreme Court as actually quite hostile, and I will say some liberal legal analysts as well try to present the Supreme Court as like hostile to Trump. But I think you have to start the story with Trump v. Anderson and Trump v. United States. And Trump v. Anderson was the ruling that held that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment doesn't apply if Congress doesn't affirmatively pass a law, so rewriting that section and allowing Trump on the ballot. And those two rulings are the backdrop for all of this.
So I might actually have a slightly different view here. And to me, what I see the Supreme Court doing is kind of like the classic John Roberts move, which is hedging. Where he wants to deliver de facto victories to Trump, right? That you have noted that's gone through the shadow docket, that's gone through some big rulings, but he wants to hedge, right? He's not prostrate the way that Republicans in Congress are just prostrate in front of Trump, right? He wants to occasionally bloody the president's nose a little bit, right? That might be tariffs, that might be the Federal Reserve case. There are a couple other things that you mentioned, the National Guard case, or that he kind of wants to maintain that institutional power and credibility on the chance that maybe someday someone who's not Donald Trump is president, right? So I see this as like a way of both giving him what he wants, like trying not to pick some fights, picking some other fights. So that's what I see going on here. And I kind of want to spin this into a larger question about what institutions have made themselves prostrate before Trump and which have defied him and which have hedged a little bit. And this gets back to some of the stuff you talked about right at the top of the episode, right? That Trump's theory, his plan was to, make this kind of assault on civil society, to remake civil society. right? You talked about him issuing these orders to like preschools or whatever to not do DEI, which is totally above the president's authority. But he did a lot of stuff, right? It's not just schools, it's not just DEI. There's a lot of other cases where he's tried to like exert pressure on, you know, institutions, not just in the government, but outside of the government.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that campaign and how it's gone for him.
I feel like I've been thinking about this in terms of, it's clearly been successful in some cases, right? There have been universities, for example, that have fully kind of been like, yeah, we're cutting, we're cutting, I'm going to use DEI as the example. We're cutting, our DEI offices, and we are changing our admissions and all these things. There are hospital systems that have been like, yeah, we're ending gender affirming care because the president doesn't like it anymore. There are law firms, or at least a couple law firms, that were like, yeah, sure, we will, bend to your demands and sign up. University of Virginia is down the street. University of Virginia signed on to some agreement about, admissions and the like. You basically, like, it's too many black people here. It's like a 6% black school, but that's too many in a 19% black school state. But there's too many black people there, so we got to get back to merit and do something about that. So you have these institutions that I think you can fairly say that their leaders are doing things that they wanted to do anyway, right? They are using, and this is, I mean, I'll say part of the administration's calculation, the White House calculation at the start, was that they did have there's a lot of sympathy towards them in the upper echelons of society, right? Like sympathy towards, anti-Me Too backlash and anti-2020 backlash, sympathy for kind of a retrenchment with regards to gender equality and gender expression. So I think the part of their calculation was, we can push this, and we're obviously going to try to coerce, but we'll find some receptive voices. Some institutions will want to be coerced, if that makes sense. And I think that's been true in some cases, and it hasn't been true in other cases. Notably, Harvard has basically tried to hold out as much as possible. And Harvard was sort of like the big, in terms of universities, kind of the big prize that the administration wanted. You have various corporations that have more or less ignored the White House when it comes to threats and pressure regarding hiring and the like. So my sense is that it's kind of a wash to an extent, that especially in the first 6 months, the White House scored real victories among some institutions in pressuring them, and those institutions just like deciding to roll over. And as the president got like less popular, as the actions being taken got more kind of egregiously tyrannical, there's been much less of a willingness to bend, in part because there's backlashes. And I actually think, and I don't think anyone's written about this, I think it probably will require like a business study, if nothing else, but the backlash to Target early on, I think really had an impact on, especially in the corporate world, leaders determining to what extent are they going to play ball, because Target immediately was like, yeah, we're going to kill all the DEI stuff. And they've kind of just entered terminal decline since then. It's a business that is really struggling to get customers. And I think it's very much a product of their early capitulation to the administration. So yeah, I think that's I don't know. That's what it looks like to me. A combination of a bunch of institutions and actors like, yep, it's MAGA America, and we just have to bend to it. And then others who, in a Roberts-esque way, were like, oh, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see what happens. Let me say, I will extend this also not just to institutions, but to just sort of, I work in the media, to the political media, which to me, it was really clear early on. There was a kind of, there's been a vibe shift. MAGA America and we have to accommodate ourselves to that. And there are, I think there are plenty of voices who have backtracked since then, but who were fully willing to kind of get on board early on under this presumption that the 2024 election represented some sea change in American attitudes, which it didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I just remember how scary it was, right? Those first couple of months after he came into the presidency, and it looked like he was attacking on every front, and like all of the elite law firms were caving, and it was like, these questions like, okay, you can sue, the government, but who's going to represent you
Right.
if everybody's afraid, right? And this fear of like bandwagoning effects that like if you can get enough of like the important institutions of civil society on your side, suddenly no one wants to be alone, right? No one wants to be alone when the government comes knocking, and that's going to like create this snowballing effect for government power. And that mostly hasn't happened, or not, at least has not happened to the extent that I think we feared at the start. I think the Target example is a really good one. There was the Jimmy Kimmel example, which caused a huge dip in subscription numbers for Disney, and Disney was like, we don't like it when the line goes down."
When the line goes down dramatically. But I mean, the interesting, the Jimmy Kimmel example, I think is so interesting because it gets to the mentality of the administration too, which is they just seem to have this view that you can like hit a button and everyone will submit. And then when that doesn't happen, they have no strategy for moving forward. So they were like, yeah, well, obviously we'll threaten Jimmy Kimmel and everyone will fall in line. And when they didn't, you could see it in Brendan Carr. He's like, I don't know what to do next. I thought it's all, they're just, everyone's going to follow the demand. And the extent to which the administration, I think, really bought its own propaganda about its standing with the public and just like did not understand what they were elected to do. And I'll say, it's not that I think the American public, I'll put it this way. If the first thing Trump had done was sent like a bunch of inflationary checks to Americans, like they could have accomplished most of what they wanted to do, right? Americans get big $2,000 Trump checks, which is what a lot of people were anticipating, and Trump gets free reign to do basically whatever he wants. And there'll be a backlash, but like I think it'd be much more muted because there'd be much more goodwill amongst kind of like the typical American. So it's not as if there wasn't a path to this, but I think they really bought their own propaganda and thought that, there is a silent majority of the 80% of Americans want this. And if we kill USAID and yell at law firms, universities, the left will cease to exist, and we will have established ourselves as like the rulers of America.
Oh, I think that's exactly right, and it gets to something that I've been cat event. It gets to something that I've been wanting to ask about from the start, which is not just the theory of how are we gonna break elite institutions or change the law or do all this stuff in government, but how do we bring the people on side, right? And you talked about this theory of the silent majority, right? The sense that like they're high on their own supply, right? These are guys who are really weird crypto Nazi, crypto, Austro fascists or whatever. They all have their favorite weird thinker.
Right.
And they're constantly like trying to like hide their power level in public or whatever. And they think, right, well, that's the average American. The average American just wants to see, deportation, Azimer, and they want to see, military guys in the street, like shooting people. That's what the average American wants. And we're going to bring people on side through the politics of spectacle. Right? Not necessarily through a careful a big administrative agency that is going to like carefully bureaucratize all the changes we want in the world, but we're going to create spectacle, right? And that's going to bring people on side. We're going to deliver them the content that they want. And I'm curious if you think that's like an accurate read of like how they were trying to proceed in terms of mass opinion, and if so, how it's worked for them.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, part of part of what I kind of struggle with here when just trying to describe any of this is that it does sound very stupid. Um, and what especially sounds stupid is that the relevant actors, the staffers in the various agencies, even some of the principals, they seem to think that the former Twitter X represents the public. That what they see on there is what Americans think. And so they're producing content geared towards basically like either bots or Nazis on the internet, and they think that that's how they're reaching out to the public. So when Stephen Miller does one of his Sephiroth rants on X, I think Stephen Miller genuinely thinks that he is expressing the view of like a typical American as he sees it on that website. And whenever I say that out loud, it sounds idiotic. Because like, why would you think that? Like, what? I can forgive a random person thinking that what they see on social media represents some sort of unmediated access to the public. But a person engaged in politics ought to know that what you see on any social media is a tightly controlled and unrepresentative sample of the larger public. And that to understand the larger public, you either have to rely on like scientific surveys, or you have to like get out there and talk to people and be in environments unlike your own. But they don't do that. They do the opposite of that, in fact. And I think that it does inform their approach. I think that the best example of this, and this was a very tragic event, was just the reaction to the shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And I'll say Renee Good, right? Because that one, at least with that one, they had like a quasi plausible story to tell. Oh, this woman was trying to attack an officer with the car. But on X, of course, they can be like, Renee Good is a terrible lib white woman, and she's the enemy, and she was trying to attack our glorious ICE agents. But a normal human being in America looks at that situation and sees a regular ass white woman like they might see anywhere else in their life, like they might know, like they might be, and they see like a paramilitary looking dude with guns and a mask, and they see her in a minivan or a hatchback SUV, and they think to themselves, what the fuck is happening here? And accordingly, in the polling, solid majorities were like, yeah, this shouldn't have happened. She shouldn't have been shot, right? Like for a regular person who's not particularly political, but just sees the images, their thought is something is wrong here. And the administration's inability to access that is just a huge vulnerability for them, because what it means is that when they want to, the State of the Union is a perfect example. When they want to try to recover, they aim their messaging at basically a small slice of their own base, and they seem to have no capacity to speak to ordinary Americans. There's been lots of talk over the years of how the political left in this country is too online, too influenced by social media, et cetera, et cetera. But I've always thought that this is just as true, if not more true, than the political right, which again just seems to not be able to even access what a regular person thinks about all of this. And I find it very strange.
I mean, I agree with what you said at the outset, which is that it can be difficult to talk about this stuff because it sounds so dumb. It sounds so crazy, right? If you try to tell somebody like, yeah, the Secretary of Defense is killing people for content because
Right.
of some weirdo, some anonymous weirdo who follows him on social media. But like, we've seen it happen, right? We just at Liberal Currents, we just ran a piece by Samuel Nagahisa called Killing for Content. And he just documents, okay, when we were doing the Maduro operation, the president and the secretary of defense were monitoring Twitter as they did it. Right. That was one of the things in their little makeshift situation room, was watching the Twitter reaction to their own operation. Right. And that in the boat strikes leading up to this, right, the Hegseth is constantly posting these images of boat strikes in the Caribbean and in the Pacific to Twitter, and being like, we just killed another narco terrorist. And one of these online right-wing weirdos will post something like, every time you kill one of these guys, it makes the libs unhappy, so you should do it more. And Hegseth replies to this guy from the official, Secretary of Defense account and says, boom, we just killed another one. And he posts another video, right? There's like a level of like feedback going on here between their own craziest base online and what they're doing in office, right? What we call audience capture, if this was just an influencer rather than a politician, right? And I think it's really interesting because this isn't necessarily even just an American phenomenon. Right, President Yoon in South Korea, who was recently sentenced to life in prison for attempting to do an auto golpe and destroy democracy in South Korea, some of what looks like happened there is that he stopped trusting his own security services to have an accurate read, to report to him honestly, like, what's going on in South Korea. And he's trusting these weirdos that he's following on, I think, Twitter, in various like private chats, more about how like actually there are North Korean spies everywhere and there's total North Korean infiltration. And if we just declare martial law, we'll solve that problem, right? That he's like cooked his own brain on these kinds, on like right-wing social media, basically. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that is totally real and totally a problem. And it is really impeding their ability to accurately understand America in a way that's kind of shocking to watch.
Yeah. I feel like at this point, I'm 38. And so this is my Obama, Biden, Trump, one Trump. This is my fourth presidency as a journalist, but it's my, fifth as just like a citizen in observing politics. I was a little nerd as a teenager. Big shock. So I feel like I've seen enough of the cycle of a presidency. And the same thing of just like reading like historical presidencies in the past. But I've seen witnessed enough of the cycle of a presidency things kind of happen. An ambitious president comes in first year, tries to do a lot. There's kind of a thermostatic reaction from the public. The opposition gets a footing, and typically in the second year, the beginning of the second year is a last-ditch effort to kind of finish the business the first year, and then it's just a bunch of trying to maneuver back to the center of American politics. So, Obama in 2010 is spending the beginning of 2010 is passing the Affordable Care Act, getting like the last bit of agenda items on the board. Dodd-Frank, I think, is passed that summer. Like the last of the big stuff. They try to get the cap and trade bill through the Senate. It doesn't work. And then the summer 2010, going into the election, are Democrats trying to tout their accomplishments, but also sort of like really try to hammer home that like, oh, we're in the center of American politics. Obviously, backlash sets in, big loss in 2010. And then 2011 is lots of bipartisan stuff from the Obama administration, partly by necessity, partly because I got to reposition yourself. The public thinks we are moving too fast. We got to slow down. Clinton famously had basically the exact same thing happen to him, except worse. Even George W. Bush was heading on that path. People forget this, but before 9/11, there was a lot of discontent with Bush. And he looked like he was heading on the path to 2002, finishing up the rest of the agenda items, and then trying to reposition himself in the center, maybe do some bipartisan tax cut stuff. And 9/11 happens, and that ends up being a big boost, and the administration can really dominate. But the 2002 midterms were a bit touch and go heading up to it. It wasn't a guarantee that Republicans would succeed. And certainly for a second term, things collapsed very quickly. By the end of 2005, that cake had been baked, right? It was done. And it was just a long decline from there. And so there's this rhythm to presidencies. And what I'm struck by in Trump, and I think it's because of just the utterly poisoned information environment of the White House, and then Trump's own indifference to public opinion. Like, he cares about it in as much as it reflects on his ego, but he does not give a shit when it comes to sort of managing administration, and the lack of political leadership from Trump. I have not written about this in like a extended way, but this to me is one of the big stories of this administration is that the president does not exercise political leadership, which means that that the White House is confused, and it's everyone doing everything. It's everyone doing what they want to do, which means that it can't really course correct because there's no one to force a course correction, and that's what's happening. There's no one to force a course correction, so it's just like, yeah, the past year didn't work. We don't know what else to do, so we're just going to do more of it. And more of the past year is just going to make people even more pissed off. Even the Supreme Court gives the president basically an off-ramp for the tariffs, and he's like, I like them so much. I love them so much. I'm a tariff otaku. I love them so much. I'm going to keep doing tariffs. And it's like, all right, this is going to be bad for Republicans in Congress. This will cost seats. This might mean the difference between a Republican-controlled Senate and a Democratic-controlled Senate, and he doesn't care. And he doesn't care, and he doesn't know to care either. And that's the other thing.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think, yeah, I mean, he does seem in some ways kind of checked out, kind of just returning to his personal obsessions. We're coming up on the end of time here, and there are two big things that I really wanted to ask you about that I think are going to be especially relevant, not to just what has happened, but what is going to come. And that is ICE, mass deportations, the deportation apparatus that is still very much getting spun up, right? The ICE is out there trying to buy up enormous prison camps. Right, they have an enormous amount of funding that just came through the one big beautiful bill. Stephen Miller is still in the White House trying to run stuff, so that's still happening. And we also see foreign policy still seems quite unsettled. Right, the Venezuela raid happened out of nowhere, and not quite out of nowhere, but felt like out of nowhere. Right, he's made these aggressive moves with regard to Greenland, with regard to Canada, with regard to Iran. And so it seems like, I think foreign policy is a place where traditionally the president has a lot of discretion, where the system allows him a lot of discretion. And so I worry that something might happen there. But we're running short on time. So I'll ask you to pick one of those two buckets. And what do you see the future holding in those areas? Or in that?
I think I can talk about them both pretty quickly. On ICE and such, it's been remarkable to see the public turnaround against that agency. People don't like seeing videos of masked men executing Americans in the street. They don't like seeing pictures of 5-year-old children being thrown into white vans. They don't like the idea. Even people who are like, get out all the illegals. When they say that, in their mind, they're picturing like a character Lou Diamond Phillips would have played in the 90s, hood movie that took place in the barrio. I watch a lot of those kinds of. I watch a lot of trash from the 90s involving very accomplished Latino actors having to slum it. So that's what people have in their minds. What they aren't imagining is the nice woman who runs a taqueria in their downtown. Right? They're not imagining the contractors who built their driveway, right? They're not imagining those people, or at least most Americans aren't. Obviously, there are chuds who imagine, we gotta get them all out. But I think that the typical person isn't imagining that. So they see those people getting arrested, thrown out, people who are just law abiding. Maybe they don't have their papers, but their view is who gives a shit? And most Americans imagine that the immigration system is coherent and makes sense, and so. They think, oh, you can just, you don't have your papers, but you can just go have a meeting and get that sorted out. No big deal. And they don't realize that it's not like that at all. and those people are really quite vulnerable. So there's been this big public I think turn against these agencies, and the thing I'm paying attention to is this effort in local community to local community to try to block the acquisition of warehouses and the construction of warehouses. And it's happening in blue states and red states, right? In Tennessee and Mississippi, right? Like people, for reasons good and self-interested, like don't want those things around them. This DHS shutdown may end up forcing these agencies, forcing ICE to kind of rely on its expanded funding to do ordinary operations, which will degrade its ability to do more of this stuff. So I'm like in this camp where they have all these resources and they're still spinning stuff up, but there's like real friction, both in terms of states and localities beginning to sort of like do what they can to impede the ability of ICE to act. And then, congressional Democrats, frankly, putting real obstacles in the face and just slowing things down. And I think right now the game is like, how much can you slow it down before the next budget? Because ideally what will happen is, Democrats win control of Congress and then just take back all that ICE funding. Just like take it back. And you can already see them messaging this. I think Ruben Gallego was saying on CNN yesterday that they took $75 billion from Medicaid to put it in the ICE. And that's the message right there. So I'm actually somewhat optimistic that you can at least roll things back to the status quo ante. The question is going to be, can you just get rid of these agencies altogether and like really reconfigure what it is we're even doing with immigration enforcement? That's like the tougher political lift. But there's enough kind of ambient anti-ICE sentiment in the society that I think you can go a long way in just like halting it. I'm much less optimistic with the foreign policy stuff precisely because the president has so much leeway. And it seems to me that we're seeing a version of what happens in a lot of presidencies, which is your domestic agenda slows to a halt. And so you're like, I still want to feel like a man. And so I'm going to do foreign policy stuff. Sometimes this is good and advantageous, as in Jimmy Carter's like, I want to try to see if I can broker peace in the Middle East. Bill Clinton, I want to see if I can't broker peace in the Middle East.
Donald Trump wants to broker peace in the Middle East.
But in Trump's case, because I'll just say in Trump's case, he also seems to become really enamored of the destructive force of the U.S. government and seems to want to fulfill himself through just inflicting violence on foreign others. Kind of, I mean, in as much as what's happening in the country is an internalization of things that we have inflicted on other countries, then that again is being reflected back on other countries. It's sort of in this like this horrible Ouroboros of violence. And so the Iran strike last year, the bizarre Nigeria strikes over Christmas, the kidnapping of Maduro, and this military buildup targeted at Iran, all seems to me to be the president saying, well, I can't do what I want domestically, so I'm just going to play with my toys internationally. And that for him means going to war. So I'm quite pessimistic about that.
I agree with you that, like you say, he seems to have become very enamored of the American military. I think the one thing I try to take solace, in, is that he's terrified of Iraq. He is terrified of like getting his hands stuck in the briar patch, and that the stuff we've seen him do has the character of raids, where he's like, if I think I can do this crazy military operation with the crazy capacities of the American military complex, I'm going to do that. But he does not want to like put boots on the ground and start an invasion that's going to tie him up. I think because like he just saw it happen to George W. and like he's afraid of it on a personal level.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like sometimes these raids don't come off quite so cleanly. So we might just wind up in that situation anyways.
The thing we have going for us is that he is a coward.
Yes.
So that's kind of that's the big thing we got going for us.
Well, could be worse notes to end on. So, yeah, this has been a really, really interesting conversation. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, as always.